Before we get into questions I do have for you, I kind of just wanted to, because you saw the film.
I did.
I know you did. And so I just kind of wanted to know your initial reaction, just in general, to seeing it.
I first just want to thank you for inviting me, and I just appreciate everyone who's here this afternoon to have this discussion with us. We will have a Q&A. I'm so excited to hear some of your questions and thoughts as well. So we will have an interactive piece of this. Thank you for providing the space for me.
Of course.
As you know, this is all I think about.
Yes.
This is like it. So my initial thought, prior to going into the film, my thoughts were, this is exactly the kind of thing that I just want to immerse myself in. And then after the film, I had a lot of tension. I just felt tension in my body. I felt like my brain was very busy. It's just, This is not a film that you walk out of and are like, oh yeah, cool. And even if you know, and I will say some of it was very predictable, but even if you know how the film goes, you walk away feeling just this visceral tension. And what I would consider, like my language, I'd say, like, I felt dysregulated. I just felt a sense of instability, and I needed to either talk about it, which is what you and I do a lot, as far as, like, get it onto the podcast, or process it. And certainly I felt like I needed to see it again, just to kind of have another way to digest all of the story.
Right. I agree with you. After I saw it, for like an hour after I came home, I was just laying there thinking about everything that happened and trying to make sense of what I saw. And it took a while to even kind of put into words what I saw in the film, what it meant, and kind of how the character was interpreted in this, I think, new way. We've seen Joker a lot on the live action screen and animation and even in the comics. And I feel like, and I'm sure we'll talk more about Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal, but I feel like there was a sense of realism in trying to show how Arthur Fleck, Joaquin Phoenix's character, turned into what he calls Joker. And even though we've seen it in Jack Nicholson and Heath Ledger, it seemed like there was just something that felt more real. And I say that with hesitation because I wanted to really ask you, because I've heard different things back and forth from people who've seen it and different, people that are on the Instagram and the podcast. And it's about the mental illness aspect, and if it's actually accurate, is it an accurate depiction of mental illness? Because I know that is the core of how they presented this character within the cinematic universe. But from anyone seeing it, is it accurate the way that they showed him, the way that it was kind of like almost a deterioration of himself going into this? Or was it just kind of more, fantastical than anything else?
Are we going to have spoilers this afternoon?
I was just going to say, because we kind of have to, don't we, a little bit? Have you guys seen it?
Can I see show of hands?
Right, who has seen it?
I figured most of you would come in having seen it.
Right.
Maybe what we will do is try to be vague about the very ending. I don't know if that's as necessary, but maybe we'll see how it goes.
Right.
I have a couple thoughts. One is that I totally agree that this is a film that has a sense of realness. And when I was writing up, I wrote a piece about it for fandom.com.
Which is awesome. Go read it.
It's 100,000 pages long. No, it is truly like the most I've written about anything in my life, which says a lot about how I felt about the film. One aspect is that Joaquin Phoenix is in every frame of this film. I think he's in every scene.
Yes.
So there is just a lot of richness. This is the story of a Joker representation. This is a version that's very unique, but it's also a version that is saturated in the piece of art. So where you have like Jack Nicholson's Joker or even Heath Ledger, there are scenes that include them. But this film is completely centered around Joaquin Phoenix.
It's a complete focus, this character study almost of
Absolutely.
Just this one person.
Absolutely. Which is why if you looked at me while I was watching, I was just like sweating and looking completely crazy. So I love that you said like there's a realness about it, and I think that for me what stood out, one of the reasons I probably felt so tense is that there wasn't a fantastical element that pulled you out of it and a little bit of safety to kind of hold you in a sense of like fictional safety. So like there was no Batman Tumblr going across the screen.
Right.
There wasn't like a Batman like sleeping upside down or toxic waste. The trolley dilemma game. There weren't elements that pulled you out to realize like, oh, this is a fictional. This is a fantasy.
You're in it the entire time on edge, not really exactly knowing what's going to happen, but yeah,
so
I
that
completely
psychological safety isn't there as much as with other portrayals. Having said that, I really appreciate where you're centering our conversation, which is not just the element of mental health, but the accuracy of mental illness. And I would say that Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal here is very accurate when it comes to mental health disorders. One, he comes out and says pretty directly he has this neurological disorder, and it actually is a real disorder. It's this sort of involuntary laughter. And it's a real neurological disorder that is often developed after complex childhood trauma and some other neurological problems. It's known as IEED, Involuntary Emotional Expressive Disorder. Very rare. But what I loved about that element was that he knew he had this issue, and he even tried to sort of explain to other people that he has this like really kind of bizarre neurological disorder.
Right. He had the card.
Yes.
That he would give to people in public who were like, why
so
are you
Joker,
laughing?
right? Like, here's this card. And the reality is that so to explain what this is, it's not just involuntary emotional expression, but it's not aligned with what the person's feeling. And I was like a very crazed viewer. I was like trying to take notes, like, when is this happening to him? And I figured that it was happening to him when he was feeling shameful. Not when he was feeling necessarily upset or angry, but it was when either vicariously he was seeing somebody be hurt or bullied and he was feeling that vicarious shame, or when he was feeling a sense of shame. And that's when the laughter was happening.
Right.
So that is a real disorder, and I thought he portrayed that well. The other disorder that wasn't as intentional or wasn't as directly named was his clinical depression. And so how he would describe this is he would tell his therapist he can't escape the pain. He would have these moments of suicidal ideation. He had moments of self-injury. And if you looked at his life, he clearly lived a very bleak life. He didn't have joy in his experiences. And when I wrote about this is kind of what stood out for me and why this Joker not only is different than the other Jokers, but is realistic, or at least more likely to be a Joker that we would see out in our version of Gotham City, which is that if we look at the other Jokers, Jack Nicholson, for instance, is this performer, and he finds delight and joy in being the center of attention. He has this narcissism, and he just loves being in the spotlight so much that brings him visceral, actual energy and joy. My favorite, Mark Hamill. Hamill's Joker from the animated series. He is a sensation seeker. So any chance, this is my joke about him, like whenever he's like having a fight with Batman, if he sees a roller coaster, he would love to just jump on that roller coaster and have that fight on the roller coaster, because he wants that physical sensation of euphoria. He loves that feeling, and when it's combined with risk, it's just really fulfilling emotionally for him. So far, and then Heath Ledger is a very intellectual Joker.
Right.
He's an anarchist. He's particularly sophisticated in his cognitive functioning.
Right. It's not just random, just chaos. It's kind of almost meditative in a sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he finds pleasure in being smarter, in figuring things out, and in actually knowing more than what's good for society or what society thinks is good for them. So this Joker isn't finding that source of joy. He does have a brain disorder. He has clinical depression. He's unable to find moments and ways that he can really find joy and pleasure out of life, which is why he delves into fantasy.
Right. I felt like, and maybe you can explain it more, one of the times that I think he expressed himself or he felt, I don't know, either validation or something, you can kind of see it in his dancing. Like there were a couple of scenes where, throughout the film where he would just kind of dance, whether it's in the bathroom or it's on the stairs or wherever. And I don't know, I felt like that kind of translated to whatever action he did, because anytime he would dance in the film 2 or 3 times, he committed like an act of like murder or crime or something really dark and awful, but for some reason that gave him something than just him being kind of the depressive person he is. So I'm not sure what that specifically is or like why that would be like the translator, but I feel like some points in the film, times he felt like, oh, I matter. Even though him mattering is because he took someone's life or he did something awful to someone else, but it gave him a sense of like, oh, see, they noticed me. And is that, I suppose, since he has been having like a bleak existence, is him committing these crimes, is that part of him trying to find himself? Or is it just kind of, oh, I just feel like randomly, committing atrocities?
I love that you're pointing that out, because those are the times that he seems to find at least this sense of belongingness or this sense of satisfaction. And I do think it's really heavily based in his fantasy or in his very like creative mind, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the times that, because his fantasy making is so powerful and strong, he's actually able to become somewhat immersed, if not lost, in his fantasies. A lot of times his fantasies are power fantasies. So being a guest of the Murray Franklin show, being this successful stand-up comedian, being a person who is in a relationship with this lovely, attractive neighbor. All of those didn't happen. All of those, at least at first, all those were fantasies. And it's here, I've seen people talk about these as delusions. And from the clinical perspective, yes, I think one could say these are delusions and that he's seeing things or imagining things that are not really there. But I saw it more as just a very strong sense of fantasy, where his imagination is what he would draw to or draw into in order to find a sense of belongingness, find a sense of satisfaction, and in order for him to feel like he had a place in this really bleak world, he had to go to that level to find that sense of connection.
And speaking of, I guess, finding a connection, I personally, when I saw the film and he did commit certain acts, for some reason, depending on what it was, I was like, oh yeah, he did that to that guy, even though they're horrible things that he did. And I don't know why I feel some type of empathy for him in some points. Now, I know that is a very common trait in Joker, right? You see it in different comics. You've seen it in, Paul Dini's Mad Love, where he's talking to, Harleen Quinzel and telling her all of these stories about his horrible childhood, and then she feels bad for him. She's like, oh, it's Batman's fault that he's the way he is. Or even looking at Brian Azzarello's Joker, the graphic novel, he does all these things. He, kills and rapes and all of these things, and yet there are silent moments throughout the book that show that, like, he's just really sad and he's really alone, even though all of these things are supposed to fulfill whatever he wants. And I guess I was very conflicted why I felt at points in the film sorry for him, when I suppose after everything is done, you shouldn't, right? I mean, in the real world, if someone does these things in real life, you don't feel sorry. You don't feel almost have some type of feeling that like, oh, I'm sorry that he feels this way, that he did this. So, and I think Joker does that a lot. He wants to make his audience feel something, even though he's a madman. So I don't know why I felt that way. And
I think this is why the film is one that I appreciate as a part of our pop culture. I love that there's diversity of representations of the Joker and that we have other versions of the Joker. But I'm one to say that I'm glad this is one of the portrayals available to us, because as we walk away from this film, when we feel that tension and we feel like what you're just describing, this difficulty, this conflict within us, I think it's important for us to learn how to manage that and to process, what does that mean about this movie?
Right.
It means that I'm kind of feeling empathy for someone who did very bad things. It means that I related almost to somebody who is supposed to be a horrific villain.
Right.
It means that I see myself as a good person and this other person as a bad person, and yet I'm aligned with them. What does that mean about me? And I think it's important for us to explore those feelings, not because every single one of us has the propensity to be a killer. I mean this because I think it's important for us to try to examine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes who could be on a pathway to self-destruction or on a pathway to antisocial behavior like this. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think a backlash is coming from is the idea that this Joker is so subversive that we are to avoid understanding him in any way. And getting a little bit of that closeness and that understanding is helpful for us to begin to have these conversations. Wouldn't we want to know a little bit more? I know this is a fictional character, but wouldn't we want to know a little bit more about what makes people do bad things? Why is it bad for us to want to explore that and have at least a deeper understanding of what that lends to that behavior?
Right. I mean, feeling the way that I described, it's kind of like, am I a bad person for feeling bad for someone who's horrible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, I am.
You're not. You are not. And this is why I'm glad we're having this conversation, is that, no, we shouldn't feel bad for liking this character, for being curious about this character. And something that I think is clear about this film is that in the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to somebody who is, very awkward, clearly has this brain disorder, doesn't really have friends, has this sort of bleak life. And I think that what's interesting about this character is that he doesn't have any evil intentions toward others. He's not provocative. He's not trying to instill suffering and pain in other people. He wants to make other people happy.
Right. He's trying to fit into society. I mean, even when he's at the comedy club watching other comics and he starts to laugh, but at the inappropriate times the jokes are, the times when the joke isn't there, but then he looks around and then he tries to laugh along with everyone else who's laughing at appropriate times. I think a lot of the film, at least in the first part, was just showing him he's trying to fit into working a regular job and even taking care of his mom or trying to be a stand-up comedian. He's trying to fit into something that everyone thinks you should be normal at, but he's just not. And I think that kind of partially led to his breaking point. But you mentioned about, I guess, conflict or almost kind of controversy that this is surrounding this film in many ways. And I wanted to first ask, do you think that it is dangerous for people to see this movie? Do you think that it's because a lot of different articles and things like that, and there were quote unquote credible threats, so they stopped screenings in certain places, and I personally don't think so, but I just wanted to see from your perspective if there is an actual legit reason why people should be fearful in seeing this portrayal of a fictional character, and if that would actually rub off in the real world. Someone's actually going to go out and do these things or be inspired. Is that an actual worry that we should have?
I think just like any single piece of art, it would be irresponsible for me to say that it is dangerous to be exposed to it. When we do not have any evidence that would be a clear and direct predictor of mass violence. And people, let me just be clear, people are worried about mass violence. They're worried about active shooters.
Right.
They're worried about incels. This is where the fear is coming from. There isn't a single piece of art, this film included, that is proven to be a direct predictor of that behavior. Having said that, this is why my leaning is to examine what this film brings about and to open a dialogue and to, I think, be more willing to have these discussions versus censorship and avoidance and making the assumption that watching this film will lead someone to engage in mass violence.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean that's what everyone's talking about. While the film, people say it's a beautiful actual piece of work and art, and Phoenix's portrayal is brilliant. Yeah. It's just I don't know. I mean, of course I am a Batman fan, and I love to watch all of the media and everything. And watching this, I felt so sad watching it personally because I kept seeing just everything just go downhill and him learning all things about his family and himself. And there was no sense of relief in the entire film. And I'm sure that there's a reason for that. But I don't think that it's a danger. I think it's more just focusing on a man kind of going through the worst of it and what that shows. And I think people are afraid that if someone is going through these things, if they are going through some type of mental illness or they, are going through trauma through childhood or in their life, can they actually, resort to doing these acts of violence? And it's interesting because the character Joker, he's still one of the most favorited villains almost of all time in fiction. And we're so captivated by him. Yeah. We are. I mean, I always ask people, who's your favorite villain? And Joker, most of the time, is that even though he's the worst of the worst, he has the biggest body count in DC Universe. I mean, it's just, he does so many horrible things, not just to the Batman family, but to everyone, and has no remorse for the things he does. And yet, in any medium, film, TV, comics, everyone just loves him. Why, as a society, people, fans, are we so interested in this person that is just the worst type of person to be excited to see? What is that?
I think with every portrayal, this might be the exception with Joaquin Phoenix, but with every portrayal, there are what I would consider like Jokerisms or like Joker essentials. And yes, I've studied this over the weekend, all of my life. And those essentials, I think, is the best answer to why we're drawn to this character. One is the fixation on chaos, like this sort of interest in turning society upside down, in subverting the norm, in being not just a rebel, but actually trying to like hijack the norms of society and threatening the calmness of society with that antisocial behavior and with the interest of toppling it. One of the other features is an interest, and again, Joaquin Phoenix may not fit this as much as the others, but an interest in wrongdoing, an interest in violence, an interest in what's considered in our society like evil stuff. Like that intrigues us. We're kind of, we would not necessarily connect to that, but I think we're curious about like what makes that person tick. A third essential is that element of, I would consider like someone who's charming, someone who is interesting, like magnetic. There's a sense of I would even say like attractiveness, depending on which Joker. And here, like I'm even feeling like a little nervous saying this. Like, who am I to say that the Joker is attractive? Because it's again subversive for me to say that I like anything about this character. I should, it's not socially appropriate for me to align to this character. But in the animated series, for instance, I find that Joker to be really appealing and humorous and charming, and that in real life, truthfully, that pulls us into him. And then that final piece is this mysteriousness that typically we don't have this origin. We don't know what makes this person tick. We don't know what their pathway was getting them there, and we're sort of curious as human beings. We want to tie those we don't want to connect those dots. We want to tie those connections, and I think that's why a lot of us are drawn to this character.
Right. The fact that in many books his origin story, like Alan Moore wrote, is multiple choice. We don't really know what's real and what's not. And even in the film, there are such blurred lines between what's real and what's in his imagination or what he's thinking. And I think what is interesting is the fact that we don't know what is real and if he's telling the truth, and that is captivating. It's more entertaining than you knowing exactly why he ticks the way he does and why he does the things. Like the falling in the vat of chemicals is probably the most common origin story, but there are other ones. And even in the film, and I've read different theories that people have about the movie, and they're saying, oh, this isn't real, or this is, or, this was all imagined. And people don't really know how to figure out what this means. I don't think people want to take it as this just happened as is. And I think because this origin story, I think people want to say, oh, well, it didn't happen. So we can kind of feel comfortable with, oh, we don't know his origin story, which makes us feel more comfortable about the character because it fits the MO of, oh, he's just a chaotic person. And so we can't understand it, so it's fine. But I think if you give an origin story to Joker, you almost have to think about, okay, what does this mean that I actually like him, or that I know where he comes from, and yet I'm still feeling the way that I'm drawn to him. I think if there's more chaos in what we know about him, you almost feel better that you're like, okay, well, we don't know, and that's fun, but I don't know.
I think the idea that watching this film would spark or instill violence means that a lot of us really, truly don't know how human psychology works. And that is disappointing, meaning that if any of us, if you think about the likelihood of this kind of behavior, simply by watching this on screen doesn't make us suddenly want to engage in homicidal behavior.
Right.
Now, there is a portion or a proportion of the population that might have violent tendencies, and we have to better understand what is the connection to that. And most of the time, it's not mental health. So mental health disorders do not account for the majority of violent acts. That's really difficult as human beings. Like, that's hard for us to kind of understand as far as the complexity of that. The majority of people who have a mental illness are likely actually to be victimized by violence, not to be the aggressors.
Right.
So I think that's truly where we get into the muddiness of this and the difficulty of really tying apart. Was it the mental illness that created or pushed him over the edge, so to speak? My philosophy around this is that it's the social forces around him. He clearly had a vulnerability. He didn't exactly have the most robust, the most resilient lifestyle. But what put him over the edge, so to speak, and not overnight. This isn't kind of a snap, right? DC snap. This isn't a snap, but this is a gradual deterioration of his functioning, and it has to do. And I think you hinted at this. It has to do with his reinforcements, his protectors being pulled from under him. So the realization, here are some spoilers now, folks. The realization that he's not, his parental history is not what he thought it was.
Right.
Learning of being abused as a child. Learning that his mother had a history of hospitalization and mental illness. And certainly some more immediate and imminent problems, losing his job, financial distress, and experiences of harassment and bullying. So that sense of thwarted belongingness. And I say that word because that is identified as one of the predictors of self-harm and harm to others, is that thwarted belongingness, meaning I have lost my ability to feel connected and a sense of belonging to society.
I guess speaking briefly about the Batman connection, since I felt watching the film that if you took out Gotham and replaced it with New York or New Jersey, or you took out the term Joker and a lot of the different elements, Thomas Wayne, you replace him with another shady politician or anything, the film would still be what it was, but I feel like usually with Joker, the reason that he wants to still be Joker is because Batman's around. You see it in different stories like Going Sane, where Joker thinks that Batman's dead, and so he decides to just turn his life around, get a real job, changes his name to Joseph Kerr, which of course turns into Joker, and he tries to live a normal life, but then when he finds out Batman's actually alive, he changes right back. But with this film, you don't have that. And he turns into Joker, whatever that means. I mean, people have theories that, like, maybe he wasn't the Joker. Maybe he's going to inspire someone else through his actions, and someone else is going to. I've gone down the rabbit hole. So I've seen lots of different ways that people are interpreting this. But, and I guess if we're thinking about it within a Batman context and how the film is still, quote unquote, a comic book film, and going forward, how creators can make a more realistic way of looking at our favorite characters and doing it in a more refreshing way. Because Batman's been told over and over and over again in so many films, and same with Joker. But is it, if creators, directors wanted to kind of have the same vibe, realness, attention to real life detail about characters, will that be somewhat dangerous? Will that be a good thing? Is it a bad thing for us to see more of our fictional characters in a real way? And yeah, will that affect us in a negative light, or is that actually a positive thing?
I'm curious if folks want to see. My understanding is this is a standalone film,
right?
And we'll never see.
Right. There's not a part two. There's not a series.
Is this? And I'm wondering if this is the kind of Gotham and the kind of setup as far as the Joker goes for a realistic, an actually realistic Batman film.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious for it. I mean, I certainly would have an openness to that, because it means then that the counterpart to this Joker, the Batman counterpart, we would have to learn about his side of this equally as traumatizing potentially, because this is sort of the balancing act of one pathway which went to violence and antisocial behavior, another pathway which supposedly is Batman's, that is pro-social and represents growth and healing and recovery. In this landscape, what would that Batman look like? Would folks be interested in this version of Batman? Some say yes. Yes.
Yeah, I would. I suppose in looking at the film and seeing that he tries to get help from a health specialist and his medication and things like that, and then that doesn't go well because funding and all of those things. Would it be different if he actually did get help? Because, of course, we can't just chalk this all up to, oh, he's mentally ill, and that's why he did all these things.
Right.
There are other factors in his life, in society, everything around him that kind of resulted in the ending. But if he actually did get the help that he needed, would this have resulted anyway, or do you think that is a big part of it? I think
this is the narrative that we're meant to understand, and that I think that we're meant to be curious about. Exactly the question you asked. I think, and I don't know if this has been discussed by the director, but my understanding is that this is a portrayal of a failed system, and that this system failed this young man.
Right.
We have, I think, for the very first time, a Joker who is help-seeking. So he's very compliant. He's going to therapy. He's taking his medication. He's willing to do his homework and write in his journal, even though that journal has some problems in it. There are some issues I have with the journal.
Oh,
the journal has some.
What are your thoughts on the journal? Because there's a lot. It's a mess, which I think is a perfect representation of like what's going on with him.
I think in his mind, he's doing his therapy homework. So the line of thinking I have is that this is the Joker who's willing to participate in the system and receive mental health support, and he has this interest in getting better. He has, as you said, he has an interest in being a part of this healthy society as much as he could be. He's trying. And yet the counterpart to this, the system as far as how his services are financed, how they're delivered to him, how good his therapist is, how healthy his therapist is. My main concern was that the therapist said directly that she didn't feel cared about. She aligned with him and said, no one cares about you, Arthur. Right. And then she said, guess what? No one cares about me either. And I wanted to just stand up and applaud in a weird, morbid way, because this is a reality that I think a lot of us can relate to. We don't have a very robust mental health system in this country. We don't have access to every person who needs mental health support and services. We have a lot of people in this country who are willing to access services and want to participate in mental health treatment. But on the other side of that, they're often met with a very expensive, confusing, and very dysfunctional system. And I think that this part of this movie was probably the part that I connected to the most and felt like this may have been a message, not just for me, but this may have been a message for us around considering, are we really taking care of each other? What are we doing, especially for someone who's at risk like this young man? And one of the lines that he said to her was, and this is, I think, at the peak of his, or the slump of his deterioration, but in my words, I would say the peak of his risk. He said, "You don't ever hear me." And at that moment, I thought to myself, anything he does after this point, yes, it's his fault. He should be responsible for his violent acts. But that was a moment in which she could have aligned with him and asked him some questions and leaned in a little bit closer to, like, what are you talking about? Let me see what's in that journal. What is going through your head?
Right.
What are you worried about?
But even at that point, she was like, "Oh, I can't do."
Oh,
anything."
yeah.
She
said,
was already,
by the
she was
way,
already
this
done.
is our last session.
Yeah, she's like, "Well, this is it."
You're right.
Before, I guess, we ask questions, I just wanted to ask, would you screen this to people in connection to learning about the difficulties of mental health and all those things, and if you did show it to people, what will be the focal points of the film that you would connect to anybody that in terms of talking about this topic of mental health? Or is this not a good film for that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is that this is not a film for children.
Of course.
Yeah. And
No.
it's weird that I have to say this, but I feel like, with
Yes.
with comic book inspired movies, we should always address
like, no
this.
Batman's in this. It's not the same.
And I would also say, and I'm not a fan of the term or concept of trigger warning, because there's actual research that shows that trigger warnings don't actually serve any good. They don't prevent more trauma from happening, and they certainly, it's not as if the trigger warnings do any harm, but they are simply unnecessary. But what I would say is that I wish upon people, and I encourage people to be thoughtful about the art and entertainment that they're exposed to the degree that they can manage that. So if this is a movie that would be difficult for someone to view at this point in their lives, and I would say the trailer is pretty close to it, there isn't something surprising about this movie.
It's not really hiding what's going on in the
No.
film.
And the second thing I'd say about that is, generally, yes, I don't think there's anything necessarily harmful about this movie. I would be I would have a willingness for people to see this movie and to screen this movie. But I think what's important is how we address the movie after watching it. There are some films that I think are really so heavy and have so much complexity around these issues that it's really healthy for us to actually process how we're feeling after we watch it. And it's not just this film. There are other films that would probably fall into this category of needing to have this human connection following that and understanding why we feel dysregulated or upset, and just to have a little bit of what I would consider like psychological safety following that. Once in a while, it's okay for us to be exposed to an upsetting movie like this.
I know this isn't connected to it, but like when I saw Infinity War and everyone died, I was so sad. And I know a lot of people were like, well, they're fictional. Why would you care? But then it's like, I know this is not what we're talking about,
No,
but I
talk
thought
about
about that, and I'm like, I felt like when Spidey died, I was destroyed, and I'm like, I know he's not real, I get it, but it bothered me.
Yeah.
It did.
Well,
It just did.
I've talked about this before, and this is probably still my pinned tweet, but you're referring to what's called a parasocial relationship. This is a non-delusional, close bond we have with fictional characters. And even though we know that the character's not real, the emotions and the feelings we have following loss like this, those are real feelings. Those are not fabricated. And research shows that those feelings with the loss of a fictional character actually very closely match the feelings of loss to a real person in our lives. So you are validated, London. What you experienced
that's so nice.
is a lot of us experienced it here. one of the things that I remember folks who went to the movie with me said is like, they're coming back, right? Like what? Like I just had
yes, I know this. Spidey has like 4 movies lined up, but I don't care.
We know this. We know this. But what's key is that, and this is where I'm at with this emotionally. What's key is that, but the other people in the film don't know that. And I'm in it with them. Right. And so I'm so aligned with the other characters in the story. Rocket doesn't know that all his friends are coming back. And that's what's devastating to me. Wow, we have gone to a completely different...
I'm so sorry.
Completely different IP.
Well, we have, I don't know, about like 10 minutes left, so open the floor
to
some
questions.
Yes.
I'm just going to repeat your question the best that I can so that we have it on available for people to hear it. You mentioned the medication. So when someone stops taking their medication, at least in this characterization, that could have been a risk factor for him, and that may have led him to be a little bit more willing to engage in violence. And you also mentioned having a family member that needs to be on medication to help him manage his outbursts, maybe. And I would say that medication, that's why medications are called stabilizers a lot of times. It helps us balance the chemicals in our brains so that we're able to manage those impulses and that we don't feel that sense of irritability, that sense of mania, that propensity or willingness to engage in acting out outbursts and violence. So there is that connection there. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay, in the back with you.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for this lecture presentation.
Great question. So the question, just to repeat it quickly, the question was about the case manager who was assisting Arthur and her sense of just being not present and the idea that she might be burnt out. I would say for sure, this professional woman is burnt out. That sounded like I was talking about myself, right? Me too, but she has the signs of burnout. So the things that we were seeing, and this is one of the reasons why I like this film too, like she wasn't really, it's not that she didn't care about him. She didn't have the capacity to care anymore. She had compassion fatigue. She was completely deteriorated from her ability to connect because she was overly exposed to the traumas of the people that she was helping, probably underpaid, probably did not get enough supervision and care for herself as a professional. And I think that in answering your question, how do we prevent that? We have to be on top of our burnout every day. Every day we have to think of ways to manage our workplace stress. And that means ensuring that we have pleasurable activities, feel-good activities, binging Netflix, going to Disneyland, playing D&D, whatever it is that makes you feel good and feel a little bit separate from your job. And the other piece is to watch your mental health. So those of us who are in the professions of helping need to be aware of where we're at in terms of our depression, our anxiety, our exposure to trauma, and we need to be mindful of those symptoms as well, and we need to seek help as well. That's a great question. Thank you.
We have time for about 2 more questions. So,
if you could pick one other member of Batman's Rogues Gallery to have a solo film in this realm of like realism, who would you pick?
Two-Face. Wow. Harvey Dent, for sure.
You got a film.
But like in this world, I would love to see that.
Oh, I would go with like, mine wouldn't work here, right? Those of you who listen to my podcast know I'm going to say like Clayface. And Clayface doesn't have a place here in this world.
But that would be amazing.
But Two-Face would work because this could happen, somebody who's disfigured and even have that kind of bipolar presentation. So I like your answer.
Yeah.
Or Killer Croc, maybe.
Ooh, yeah.
That probably wouldn't work in this world.
Okay, one more question, I think.
How about a great question?
That is a good question.
So to summarize the question, it was why the Joker and Batman might have they both have histories of trauma, but why one might lead to antisocial and violent behavior, and one might be more pro-social, like Batman's.
Who's still violent.
True.
But it's fine.
No, you're right. And this is very complex, but I will just name a couple things from the research that have been shown to be predictors of recovery and some are predictors of lack of recovery. I'll put it that way. So, for instance, social support is one of the most important predictors of recovery following a trauma, especially childhood trauma. So that means that having usually an adult caregiver or somebody who's loving, compassionate, supportive. I don't think Arthur really had that, right?
No,
So that's
no.
one risk factor for him. The other, which you named, is the number of traumas. And research shows that there's actually a special number. I don't think special is the right word, but there's sort of a threshold, and that's 4. So people who have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood events, in their life have a much higher likelihood of developing mental health, medical health conditions, and are more likely to die from suicide. So childhood traumas and repeated childhood traumas are very I would say very identifiable risk factors. And as far as your question in relation to violence or deterioration, destruction versus healing and pro-social growth, I think that has a lot to do with interpretation. And we talk a lot about this on the Arkham Sessions because we really focus on villains individually. But what is the interpretation of this bad thing that happened to me? Is it that the world is evil and it's imposing on me my place in this world? Is it teaching me that I shouldn't trust anybody, that I'm not worthy, that if I create positive connections, that I will be victimized or I will be hurt? Those ideas will lend itself to somebody who's more antisocial and destructive. If the interpretation is, how can I actually prevent this from happening to other people like me?
Right.
That's a little bit more growth, right? That's turning it. It's almost interpreting it in a positive way.
Which is kind of what Batman does. He wants to protect Gotham because he wants to make sure no one suffers anything that he suffered with his parents dying or any crime or anything. So I think, and of course Alfred was there for him after this, whereas, like you said, Arthur, like, he didn't have anybody. And so I think that that's probably why Bruce kind of went towards Batman. He still is beating up people. He's not killing anybody, but he's sending them to the hospital. I think he's still putting out that, like, aggression that he has, but definitely he's leaning more towards, I want to help, more than, like, I feel like the world around me, is bad.
We've got to make a plan to have a panel focusing on Batman, clearly, because I probably have like 20 more things to say about that.
know.
But I absolutely agree with you that,
Right, yeah.
I would say Batman is unwell. There are times that he's not dealing with his trauma well, and he has additional growth to make. So I appreciate your comments on that, too.
I wish we had more time. I really do. But I do want to thank you, Drea, for coming on the panel, and I want to thank everyone for coming. And I really hope that this discussion opened your eyes. It did for me. I had so many questions, and I loved this discussion. So thank you so much, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.